We have one more article that we're going to cover today, and we'll go from there, see if any questions pop through, or we may call it a day. But this is an article by Joe O'Leary. Here's when your high yield savings account doesn't make sense. Let's go ahead and take a look and see what we got here. A high yield savings account is one of the easiest wins in personal finance, and I keep my whole $20,000 emergency fund in one. But sometimes it's the wrong tool for the moment. Sometimes it's the right tool used badly. Here are common situations when a high yield savings account is the wrong move and what to do if you're in one right now. You're carrying credit card debt. Okay, I think I'm going to like this one. If you're carrying credit card balance, the interest you owe dwarfs the interest any savings account can pay you. True. The average credit card charges 21%, $6,000 balance at that rate costs you roughly $105 a month in interest. That same $6,000 and a 4% APY savings account earns about $20 a month. You're losing around $85 every month you save instead of paying down. Never carried a balance myself, but if I had one, I'd pull from my savings account to get out of that debt ASAP. Coached a bunch of friends out of debt, and the winners all did the same thing. They kept a small cash buffer, stopped saving, and threw everything at the balance. A balance transfer card with 0% APR can help you knock it out faster. A paid off card is a guaranteed return. No savings rate can match. It's very true. Debt and interest on debt is money lost forever. It does you absolutely no good. So if you have money sitting in cash that is earning you less than what your interest rate on your credit card is, then it really does make sense to pay it off. Now, an emergency fund I still think is valuable. So I don't think you should go to zero savings altogether, because then you end up back in the same issue if an emergency happens. But you probably shouldn't have a fully funded emergency fund until that high interest credit is gone. High interest debt is gone. All right, let's see what number 2 is. You're earning pennies when you could earn dollars. If your savings account pays I thought we were doing high yield savings here, but if your savings account pays 1% APY or less, it's grossly underperforming. Don't worry, the fix takes 10 minutes. Most savings accounts are brutal. The average is just 0.38 on 15,000. That average pays about 60 a year. Oof. Meanwhile, top online high yield savings account right now pay between 3 and 4%. On a $15,000 balance, you're now looking at $450 to $600. You get the same access and the same federal insurance, just more interest. I used to keep my emergency fund in low rate savings account. Today, though, it's earning 4% APY and I'm earning over $800 a year in interest. If you're shopping around, a great option right now is the American Express high yield savings account. Is this a sponsored? It pays a competitive rate, charges no monthly fees, and asks for no minimum deposit. Boring and reliable is exactly what a high yield account should be. So it's at a 3%. It's very interesting. I wonder if this is sponsored here. But wasn't this when your high yield savings account doesn't make sense? This is not talking about a high yield savings account and that you should get a high yield savings account. This is a misnomer here. What is that? Anyway, all right. Your emergency fund has grown too big. Cash hoarding is one of the most expensive habits I see. Extra cash might feel safe, but at 4% APY against today's 3.5% inflation, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, it barely holds its value. Beyond a 3 to 6 month emergency fund, excess savings should be invested longer term for a higher potential ROI. The overall stock market has historically grown at 10% annually. That rate compounded over decades makes a huge difference in growth. Say you're holding onto an extra $20,000 in savings above and beyond your normal emergency fund. Invested for 20 years at 10%, you're looking at about $135,000. Yeah, there's no doubt about it that if you have too much cash sitting aside, it can be an absolute drag on it. But assuming you set your emergency fund properly, when it's going to grow at almost the rate of inflation, so your expenses are likely going to grow by inflation. So that makes your emergency fund growing by inflation okay. And then you'd also have to multiply it by months. I think where I kind of strongly disagree with this guy is the 3 to 6 month emergency fund. Number one, people always end up spending significantly more than they thought during an emergency. You know, we say our expenses, they're around 2,500, but when you really do a budget and you break it down, you're like, man, that's actually 4,000. And then on top of that, when people lose their jobs there's almost never a pure discipline when it comes to it. They end up spending more than they thought. So that 3 to 6 months actually becomes more like a month and a half to 4 months of emergency fund. And that's a scary place to be. So I actually think 12 months of basic living expenses is right, knowing you're probably not going to keep your budget as clean as you think you are. All right. You're working too hard for marginal gains. If you're hopping between banks to grab every extra tenth of a percent, you're working too hard for too little. Same goes for jumping through hoops to unlock a headline rate. Usually, accounts with big APYs have strings attached, like a top rate that only applies to your first few $1,000s, a monthly direct deposit minimum, and some other things. I'm not saying these are bad account conditions, but if they don't fit how you naturally save and require too much effort, the extra APY isn't worth chasing. I'm an optimizer by nature, so I get the temptation. But on a $10,000 balance, switching from 3.75 APY to a 3.9 APY nets you about $1.67 a month more in interest. That's hardly worth opening a new account for. Pick one solid account with no strings and leave it alone. The best rate is the one you'll keep earning without babysitting it. That's true. Your emergency fund and high yield savings is not where the majority of your growth is going to come. Now, if you're a millionaire and your emergency fund is a crazy amount of money, that 0.2% can actually make a big difference. But for most people, normal people, it's really not worth it. Um, find your safe spot and just let it run. Unless there's a significant difference between the APYs, it's not really worth it. Now, I've noticed this one thing. It keeps saying high yield savings account, and I'm going to address this here at the end, but where a high yield savings account still wins for your emergency fund and any cash you'll spend within a year. A high yield savings account is still the best home there is. It's liquid, it's federally insured, and it pays many times what the average account does. The trick is using it for the right money. Keep your safety net there and stop letting it hold the dollars that should be paying down debt or growing in the market. Take 2 minutes today, log in, check your rate, and check your balance. If the rate's too low or the pile's too big, you already know the fix. All right. So I mean that's true. You always want to adjust it. You don't want too much. You don't want too little. The one thing I want to add here is I actually believe money market funds are a great place for your emergency fund as well and your cash. They actually generally tend to pay higher rates than a high yield savings account. The one thing you have to know is they're not insured the same way banks are. They don't have FDIC insurance. A lot of them will have SIPC insurance. I'm not really going to cover the difference between the two now, but one is for investment companies, one is for banks. The banks are a little bit easier. But I want to be real that most of the time, if you're ever needing those insurance, there's a lot of bad things going on if you are getting paid out on that. So anyway, a money market fund at an investing institution, I'm not going to recommend any, even though I did work at a place for a long time and that's where mine is. I'm not recommending it because there might be ones with higher interest or maybe a higher trust. Maybe you have a higher trust in another company. But either way, at least compare a money market rate of return to a high yield savings account rate of return to see if you can get a significant more amount of interest every month.